Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of In Leader's Mind, a channel where we discuss things that are relevant to CEOs. I am a Vistage chair, meaning that I am working with a group, or two groups actually, of CEOs in Seattle area that are working through complexities and issues that we are facing in current times. I'm starting another group, and this is my way of inviting people to join into the discussion, my group, as well as to learn what are the types of discussions that we have in Vistage. So today's discussion is about the future of economy in 2022, 2024. This will be a short session. We will have a May update as we normally do. So essentially, this is kind of a state of the union discussion about where we are, what are we thinking, acknowledging that the situation that we are facing is unusual and unprecedented. So what do we have today? So let's take a look at where we are. So in our forecast, what we are seeing is that the future of US economy is still strong and growing, but the GDP is flattening. So what does that mean? It means that the last few years since 2019, the low time, and the 2020 and 2021 steep increase in our GDP, we are exiting that steep increase. So it doesn't mean that our economy is going to start declining. It is just going to grow at a more sustainable rate. So if you take a look at this 2021, 2022, 2023, etc., green line, it evens out to be relatively similar to what we were having between, let's say, 2014 and 2018. So it's a sustainable growth, not as steep as it was in 2021. However, it is more sustainable, and that is going to give us a chance to even out in some of the areas where we are facing inefficiencies, aid, and dysfunction right now. The indicators that we are basing these trends, these forecasts on, are essentially a whole bunch of financial indicators that exist. ITR is the source of my information. Clearly, they're using JP Morgan, OSED, G7, Purchasing Managers Index, PMI, the confidence of the consumer market, etc., etc. And essentially, what we are seeing is that in many cases we are seeing a decline. The area where we are saying rise, there is a rise in the sales through retail, brick and mortar, and online. That is remaining strong because there is still some money left in the citizens' pocket from the stimulus that we had. So that is going to continue going strong. All of the other indicators that we are following are showing certain levels of decline. What we are seeing is that the retail sales are still strong, but they are not as strong in 2022 as they were in the beginning of 2020 and 2021. So what we are looking for is, this is basically a rate of change analytics. So this is not actually how the economy is growing. This is how the change from month to month, 12 on 12, or the last 3 months is showing. So if you can take a look at this steep growth, that was basically exiting the 2020 and into 2021. That is essentially where stimulus money was causing people or allowing people to spend money on things that they needed. The 12 on 12 is basically, of course, a softer increase. The 3 on 12 is showing a steep increase that essentially has caused some side effects to the supply chain and the inefficiency that we have seen that. However, if you take a look at the steep decline in 3 to 3, means 3 to 12 means that our rate of change is declining. It's decreasing. What does that mean? That doesn't mean that the retail sales are going to decline. It just that means that they're going to be more predictable in their trending, and they're going to be growing. So they're growing, but less so. Here is basically what we are seeing is that we had 2020, the average growth is 3.9%. In 2021, we're still going to have very high growth, and it's going to be evening out to something that is closer to our 10-year average. So what does that mean? So essentially, these declines or change in the steepness of the curves essentially indicates that we're going from about 20% year-over-year increase to something that is much more sustainable. If we take a look at the our total retail sales, they're still in trillions and they're still huge. What we are seeing is that there are little blips that we are seeing in the short-term analytics, but the number are still is increasing. So we can expect from 2022, 23 and 24 to have overall strong economy and strong retail sales. Part of the story that we are seeing here is that we're still having pretty low debt service payments per US household, meaning that the stimulus money that has decreased them to a record low, which was in 2020, maybe the second part of 2020, which is basically these two dips. These were two dips when essentially the people were having more money in the bank than they normally have. And that has stimulated the debt service payment as a percentage of disposable income to the record low. So we're getting out of that. It is still a very low number. If you take a look at 2008, 2009, the numbers were in the 13%. So in other words, there was much, much less disposable income. Right now, we're 9.2%, which is a pretty low, and actually it's a record low. So the fact that it is going higher means that that money is being drained, and essentially what we think is that's a result of the stimulus change. We are also seeing a slowdown in non-defense capital goods expenditures. In other words, B2B commerce is slowing down. What do we mean by that? Well, if you take a look at the non-defense capital goods for new orders, that essentially are these two lines. The 12 over 12 is showing that is reaching a plateau. The short-term change is even more drastic. In other words, if we compare the current state, which is, let's say, February, March of 2022 over the 2021 same months, and if we take a look at those changing 1 month increments, we will see that there is a significant decrease in business-to-business orders. So what does that mean? It probably means that essentially what we are seeing here is that many of the businesses have overstocked their inventory in items that they could have overstocked, and so they are seeing a somewhat of a softening demand, which means they're ordering less. So does that mean that our inventories are now fine all of a sudden? No, not at all. What that means is that in some areas of the e-commerce, of the commerce between businesses, we have softness. Why? Because we probably didn't have a high degree of dysfunction in the supply channel. And in some areas where we still have the issues, such as semiconductors and some of the raw materials, that issue continues. However, if you take a look at the new orders are still very good on 12 to 12. The confidence index is declining. So the green line, which indicates the confidence index, of course, there is a gap between the current confidence index and the orders that we are placing on a yearly basis. We're seeing the lower confidence index, which essentially means that people believe that the economy in the future is going to be worse than it was in the past. It doesn't mean that it's going to be bad. It just doesn't mean that it's going to be as strong and as bushy-tailed, bright-eyed as it was in 2021, which means that some of the subjective choices in placing orders are going to be driving us to place fewer orders. So if you take a look at the delta between the customer confidence index and the new orders, the gap is about 12 months. So we can expect that this dark line that is presenting the actual orders will decline over time. Again, we are talking about rates of change. We're not talking about what is the number of dollars invested. We're just talking that the numbers of dollars invested will be lower than they were in the past. However, they may still indicate the orders are surpassing the demand. I'm sorry, that the orders are surpassing the supply. So in other words, we can still continue to have some supply chain issues, but as a colleague of mine, Ron Crabtree, said recently, it will get better, but it will take time. So in other words, we will talk a little bit more, and if you want to learn more about supply chain specifically, take a look at my most recent LinkedIn Live event with Ron Crabtree, where we discuss supply chain in detail. Wall Street indication here is that we are having a gap between the raw and the domestic profits. So in other words, the return on investment from the S&P 500, the value is increasing. The domestic profits are decreasing, which means that our PE ratio is increasing, and that adds risk to the Wall Street. So how much risk? That is hard to say, but we probably are due for prolonged adjustment. Prolonged adjustment means that we probably will have a decline that we are already experiencing, partially because of the Ukraine-Russian conflict, and that may continue regardless of the international situation. Why? Because we have pretty much lots of risk at this point in Wall Street. When the P ratio is higher, that means that there is an adjustment due, as we have seen in 2000s, a little bit in 2008 with a big dip in both. But at this point, we're just creating essentially kind of a little bit of a bubble. So the costs that we are dealing with clearly are driving the inflation, and through the prices that we charge, an increase in the prices, that's a future driver of inflation. So what do we see when it comes to the raw materials? Well, we're looking here at some of the ferrous materials and non-ferrous materials, primarily metals. We're seeing that most of the prices have peaked. Does that mean that they're not going to continue rising? No, they may still continue rising, but at a much lower pace. So what does that mean? That means that we are, in some cases, going to see a decline in prices. In some cases, we're going to see prices remaining the same. The reason for that is that the prices have increased because of the high demand and because of the inflation. You can probably add some dysfunction in supply chain, the very high demand in the consumer sector, et cetera, but the main things are high demand and inflation. So high demand may have driven the prices higher than inflation alone would have. But as the inflation creeps up, the need to lower the prices decreases as well. Consequently, we may stay at the high prices. Any future increases in prices will be less likely to happen as frequently as they did in the past. However, the story about inflation is not done. We will address it more. We are not done with inflation by no stretch of imagination. If we take a look at how certain industries are faring, you can take a look at basically A, B, C, D. These are essentially ratings as to where they are currently and where they are heading to. So in other words, the shorter term analytics indicate whether they are continue to be in the state where they are, or they're going to be going down or up. So if you take a look at essentially, I'm not going to go through all of these, take a look at the ones that interest you. A means that we are getting out of the slump and we are into the better times. B means that we are in the better times and we're peaking out. C means that from the better times we're going into a decline, and D means that we are reaching bottom. So in other words, you can take a look at where we are in different industries. If we have higher letter B in this case as a current state and the next state is C, it means that we are probably closer to C than to the beginning of B, which means that probably aerospace here is flattening at the peak. When we take a look at automobile, it means that they have bottomed out and they are getting into the growth phase again, etc. Take a look at in the areas where we have the same letters, such as in electronics and new orders, C to C means that we are stable within this decline phase, and we're going to remain in it. So anything interesting here, particularly, well, manufacturing index is B to C, which means that we have kind of peaked. And so what does that mean? It means that probably we're all at the point that we can produce all we can produce, and essentially the rest is either constrained by the demand or by our ability to produce. If we take a look at the rest of the industries, pretty much a similar situation. You can take a look at many of the industries are either going from the peak into the decline, or in some cases they are going from bottom up, from bottoming out to the incline, or should I say growth phase. So clearly very important, multi-tenant retail is a driver in the economy, as well as private residential, and essentially they're going from the recovery into a exponential growth. So that is a good news, because that means that we are in the recovery in 2022. This is an interesting thing that I like to sometimes refer to. This is just the unit sales in the United States. So if we take a look at where are we heading in automotive industry, we're going still to the transition from internal combustion engine, ICEs, to the EVs. The clear winner are the hybrids. It is likely that in a couple of years we will have majority of sales that are at least a hybrid, if not an EV. As you can see, between January 2020 and 2022, the sales of EVs have more than doubled. It is still a small number, and I believe that the current cost of gas, as well as instability in in the oil industry will drive this thing in even further. Just to note that US here, based on this number, is definitely a lagger when it comes to adopting EVs. There are many countries in Europe where the new car sales are over 50% in favor of EVs alone. So what does that mean? Well, that means that internal combustion is on the way out. And what that means is that if your business is related to supplying any parts or working with industry that relies on internal combustion, make sure that that is not the only expertise that you have. Make sure that you're developing some expertise either in the electric portion or in the industry that is not declining. The rise in housing, short of it is that we are still in the growth phase. We are still growing, and the single unit housing is still increasing, but the demand is leveling off. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we probably will have another record year in 2022 when it comes down to the increase in prices of the single housing market. However, is it going to continue for a long time? Well, but that will depend on quite a few things. On the top end of the housing market, it is largely fueled by the Wall Street wealth. If we have a decrease in Wall Street wealth because of the adjustments, we will probably see an effect on the upper portion of the housing market, the houses that are in excess of multi-million-dollar values. In the middle of the market, where the average house is value standard, that is very much dependent on the interest rates. And so interest rates are expected to rise. We'll mention sooner by how much. And you can expect that increase in interest rate will suppress the demand, at least in the short term. It will increase the value of the houses and asking price. Why? Because higher interest rates drive higher mortgages, and people can only afford so much in their monthly mortgage. And that is kind of the stronger driver of what people can afford than the asking price. The asking price gets adjusted. So in other words, if we have 6-7% interest rates, the value of the homes will decrease significantly relative to right now. Why? Because the mortgage will increase on the monthly basis. Let's take a look at the multi-housing is rising. So as we all know, during the last 2 years, multi-housing, rental properties, and condos have decreased in value in many markets. Well, they are recovering back. When it comes down to the rents in Seattle, we have seen a 30% increase year to year in rents. And why is that? Well, because people are finding that it is still a valid and valuable place to be at. And so we're seeing an increase in the multi-housing starts by 21% when we talk about 12 on 12. And a little bit more jaggedy, but still a very high number in 3 to 12, which means that we are pretty much in a very strong place. The 1,000 of units are still increasing, and that number is increasing. Short-term indication is that is slowing down a little bit, but this is nothing to worry about because all of these numbers are increasing. So we expect that multi-housing market for 2022, 2023, and until 2024 is still relatively robust. When it comes down to commercial construction, same situation as in consumer, or should I say residential construction. However, they are having an 18 months lag. So what does that mean? It means that we are seeing some growth in housing starts when it comes down to commercial construction. There is a bit of a decline in the steepness of it. So basically, if we take a look at, we're probably at this peak. So the rate of change will slow down. In other words, we will probably have fewer starts in 22, 23, 24. However, as you guys in commercial construction know, the life cycle of this project is usually multi-years, which means that the slowdown is not going to be extreme, as you guys can see. It's going to be affecting us 18 months or more. So basically, the forecast for 22, 23 is very strong for the commercial construction. The supply chain, and again, I have to refer you to the discussion that I had recently with Ron Crabtree, who is the CEO of Meta Experts. He is heavily involved in the supply chain. Some of the things that we are seeing is basically a little bit of reprieve, a little bit of relaxation in the delta between supply and demand. So that's why this little thing here, this little black line is decreasing. The purchasing managers index is declined more rapidly, which means that the belief that the need to supply, to place orders for extra materials as a perception is declining. That doesn't mean that that we will not need to place orders for large numbers of items. No, I think the demand may still continue to rise, but at a slower rate. So what are we seeing here? Well, we are hoping that we are seeing here that basically with a fewer orders put in place, we will have closer to adjustment, at least in some industries that were dysfunctional, closer to an adjustment in supply and demand, which means the supply chain will start to heal itself. Is that going to be true for all of the industries? The answer is absolutely not. Case in point is the unrest in Ukraine, and the invasion of Russia into that area is causing European automotive industry to be facing shortage in automotive looms. In other words, wiring looms that are used by all of the manufacturers to communicate signals and deliver power to different parts of the cars. Many of them are produced in Ukraine, and clearly Ukraine is not an option right now to rely on. So that is going to impact European, especially German automotive manufacturers, Volkswagen, BMW, Benz, and whatnot. And does that affect us? Well, not directly. However, if there is a fewer cars produced in Europe, or if they have to look for a second source that is in a higher price country, which is of course their second choice, the prices of European cars will increase, which means that will have inflationary effect on all of the cars sold in the US. Clearly, when competition raising prices, the domestic industry does the same. So which means if relevant part of the industry has an increase in prices, the whole industry tends to have inflationary effect. So, and this is just one of the examples. So in other words, we are still dealing with some level of pressure in the supply chain. Another anecdotal comment from Ron Crabtree in supply chain is that we expect a significant increase in cost from China. In his words, they are significant, 50% or a couple of times. What does that mean? That means that if we're relying on the international supply, especially from Asia, we will face increase in prices there as well. Labor. So the quit trend is hoped to slow down. Why is that? Well, because the industrial production index is expected to slow down. The demand for workforce is supposed to be slowing down, and that means that with the exhaustion of all of the stimulus money that has been given by government to the individuals, we will have probably some turnaround, and people will be coming back either from not working or from premature retirement or whatever the case may be, and coming back into the industry. We still believe that it is going to be a very tight market. However, we believe that there will be a return of some number of the missing workforce, and that is a topic probably in itself, but we expect that demand and the money that they have that are essentially now using to not work will decline, which will force them to go back into the workforce. Anecdotal information in the labor shortages is that a good percentage, about 30% of the workforce is missing from the market as of beginning of 2022. So of course that creates huge unrest in the both wages and the availability of workforce that we have to pay for. Anecdotal information is that many of the people who have exited the market are essentially people in their later stage of career, and many of them have essentially just decided that it's not worth their time to spend their last years of their life under the circumstances that the 2020 and 2021 have exposed us to. So in other words, we have early retirement, or even sometimes retirement in time. It's just forced retirement, which means that all the workforce may have exited, which is creating a problem both in the loss of education and experience, as well as just workforce in the areas where the older workforce could have contributed. Now, that's not necessarily to say that they can't change their mind and come back, and I think that is a possibility, especially if we as employers have lower demand on extra work, which is something that older employees are not willing or able to do. This is an interesting thing in addition to the previous slide. So what do we see? Well, we have some areas in the country that are suffering from not enough young workforce. What does that mean? It means that essentially they do not have an equal number of people entering as exiting. And specifically in these states, we have a lack of millennial and Generation Z people. So basically Maine, Florida, Hawaii, etc., have essentially fewest young people as a percentage of total. Now, this is not necessarily an indicator of labor. This is an early entering force that they're entering, but essentially means that in the years to come, they will have a shortage if nothing changes. Another way of looking at the same shortage is whether you have aging population that is exiting the workforce, and that is looked at people over 70. So again, these are the states that have the most people that are going to be exiting the workforce, which are going to create another vacuum there for the workforce. The worst states, the states that are in the worst trouble are the ones who have these dots. So in other words, what does that mean? They are in both of these columns. So they will be suffering from not enough young people and older people exiting the workforce. So the a few states that we have here that are essentially listed as Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and then Montana and Arizona on the other side with Vermont here, they have problem on one side or the other. So in other words, in, for example, Nevada, Washington, and Oregon, that may mean that additional wage increases will have to be added to these segments, these states, to invite and help younger people move in. In other words, they will have to become more attractive as states. What to do with these states that are having declining population based on the exiting? Well, they will probably have some decrease in the housing, of course, because the demand may outstrip the supply may outstrip the demand. So, especially if you're in the states that have a dot next to them, think about where to develop your future production capacity, not in these states. Inflation, one of the final slides. So inflation, what we have is a huge consumer price index to total government spending has been experienced in 2021 to 2022. Past 2022, it is expected that it will, essentially the pressure will decline. What does that mean? It means that the government will be spending less and US consumer price is going to be declining. So what does that mean? Does that mean that we are going to have a decline from the current rate? Well, unfortunately, no. In other words, what we think is that there will be months where we have lower than 7.5%, which is the current rate as of February 2022. However, what does that mean? That means that we may have months where we have higher, we have months when we have lower, but it is going to be much more turbulent when it comes down to the inflation. Why? Well, because we still have dysfunction in many parts of the economy. We have instability on the international markets, and the globalization as such is becoming somewhat shaky ground to be on, because the dependencies on the dysfunction seem to catch you if you are exposed or if you're local. So in other words, the inflationary pressures will change, but they will change from month to month, which means that if you draw a line, we think that the overall line may be lower than 7.5% in 2022 and 2023 and 2024. However, if you take a look at the ups and downs from month to month, it will probably not feel very stable. So if we take a look at the consumer price index, we're expecting that in 2022, the price index is going to decline, which means downward pressure on the inflation. However, you can see that it's not going to be a steady slowdown and then even Steven situation. Now we will have ups and downs, and so consequently expecting that inflation will going to be relevant is not going to be the case. The expectation that on the whole inflation will decrease is probably likely to happen. Again, it depends a little bit on the international markets as well, and the instability in Europe right now is a kind of a question mark. So what is the recap? So the recap is that from the perspective of our planning, we need to be okay and know how to handle inflation. We have spent lots of time discussing this in 2021 at Vistage, and I had some presentation online for the rest of the folks where we predicted what needed to be done. And many of the members of my groups have gotten ahead of the inflation, which means that they have remarkably high return on investment right now. Some of the members from my group are reporting 3x 286% to be exact, increase in gross profits. Why? Well, because they are pricing themselves based on the demand, based on the cost of goods, and they are ahead of the wage increases and the wage pressures, which means that they make the money before they distribute the money, and that gap allows them to have remarkably high return on investment for the time being. So in other words, that is my hope for all of you, which is to find a way to get ahead of the inflation. And simply put, the most likely way to getting ahead of the inflation is to make sure that you are realizing your revenue at an increase rate before the pressures of cost of goods sold, wages, and whatnot catch up with you. So in other words, this is an exercise in flexibility, in doing things differently than we did in the past, which means you have to look up ahead. You have to understand your situation in your ecosystem and how much flexibility do you have to increase your prices, and never be reactive in those situations. So expect further cost increases. Some of the beliefs outside of what can happen because of the European unrest is that in the US, we have another 2-3 months to increase our prices without the pushback, meaning that inflation is high, our ecosystems can take additional price increases. Why? Because things are still unstable and we are looking at where we need to end. Many companies that procure goods from elsewhere are saying, listen, I don't care about the price, I care about getting my stuff to be able to run my production. And that is an opportunity for all of you who exist somewhere within those ecosystems to essentially get ahead of the inflation, meaning that you are charging for your goods and services at a higher rate than you did in the past, so that you can create a little bit of cushion that is going to be needed for you to survive, both to survive the loss of the value of the dollar, that's going to be at this point 7% from January to December, as well as increasing the costs and wages that you will be facing. So in other words, best to earn the money and have it, realized before we are facing all of the pressures that we will. Rise your prices while inflation is rising. That is right now. Again, if you plan to have an increase in prices in 2022, best to do it as soon as you can. Invest in automation now. In other words, if automation is something that you can benefit from in the short term, now is the time to do it, because the window is relatively short. We can only see 2.5 years into the future or so. So in other words, if you want to do it while the economy is good and get a return on investment, make sure that you're investing in automation with intent to have a payback before 2 years are out. 2025, 2026 are unclear at this point from this vintage point. What we know is that there is an adjustment coming up. This may be a temporary adjustment in 25 and then a bigger adjustment towards the end of the decade. Recommendations. Budget for growth in 2022 and into 2023. Again, focus on the short term. Do not overextend for the long-term investments. Do not expect that you're going to be able to expand your production, your services forever. Opportunity does exist in 2022, 23, and 24. But that means that if you are planning to expand with an intent to get a return on investment sooner rather than later. A relevant thing is to review what you can stop doing. So if you have less profitable portions of your business that are either facing fierce competition or they are simply not in the growing area of your business, that's a good idea to review and see if you can stop doing it. In other words, finding third parties to do it for you, or if it's necessary, or simply not having that offering is a good thing at this point to do. Prices increase in this quarter, so that's a call to action. Plan for higher wages. Tight labor market stays for the time being. Pretty big downfall of the economy will be required for us to even out in that respect, which means tight market, higher wages work hand in hand. What are the things that you can do internally to your company? Work on your culture. Make sure that you understand and can minimize your attrition. Increase stickiness. What does increasing stickiness mean? It means that people are not going to quit if they are at a discrepancy of 5% relative to the competitor. So in other words, you want to make sure that you are as sticky as you can. What does that mean? That means people are treated well, people are compensated well, and people are having some kind of a long-term incentive to stay with you. Differentiate, innovate, acquire with short-term return on investment intentions, and improve efficiency. So clearly, that's not a new thing. It's important for you to consider whether you're differentiated enough to be able to command your own prices and survive the ups and downs of the upcoming months. Innovation and acquiring short-term with a short-term ROI intent. Think about if you need to build or acquire a new factory or provide new services, whether that is going to be able to yield you returns on investment soon enough so that you can have basically a way to benefit from it while the economy is growing. And of course, invest in sales and marketing. This is kind of a low-hanging fruit. Why do I even have it there? Well, because it seems that over the last 2 years, we had a very high demand. Consequent, sales and marketing did not have to be involved as much. And of course, I'll take that with an asterisk. Not everybody would agree with that. And the second thing is that we are working from home. So it is possible that sales and marketing are not living up to their highest potential. And that's why essentially reviving them and focusing on them is a good way to achieve many of these things. That's all I have for you today. So thank you for participating. Thank you for listening. Feel free to send me any needs, any correspondence that you may be interested in. Feel free to reach out if you want and to leave comments below this thing, and look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.